There's a researcher known online as Nightmare Eclipse. Since April 2026, they have published 10 separate zero-day vulnerabilities in Windows, 10 unpatched working exploits released publicly, one after another on a cadence that has left Microsoft's security response team scrambling, and the security research community simultaneously alarmed and transfixed. The researcher is not working for a nation-state. They're not part of an organized criminal group. They are a single individual, operating out of frustration with what they describe as Microsoft's inadequate handling of responsible vulnerability disclosures, methodically releasing working exploit code for vulnerabilities they had previously attempted to report through official channels. And Microsoft, in their view, had not acted on with sufficient urgency. The result has been one of the most extraordinary vulnerability disclosure campaigns in recent Windows history. And the vulnerabilities being disclosed are not theoretical. They are verified. They work. And every single one of them represents a way into your Windows machine that did not require your password, your fingerprint, your PIN, or your permission. This is the full story of what has been found, how it works, which machines are affected, and what you need to do right now, today, before the next proof of concept drops. Let's start with ShieldBreak because it is the most recent and in some ways the most alarming disclosure in the Nightmare Eclipse campaign, specifically because of who independently verified it and what they found. A security researcher known as Nightmare Eclipse has published ShieldBreak, a new Windows zero-day vulnerability that allows attackers to escalate privileges to system level on fully patched machines. The flaw exploits a weakness in Windows Defender and affects Windows 10, Windows 11, and Windows Server 2025. Both security researcher Will Dorman and Kevin Beaumont verified the exploit works. The researcher claims the exploit achieves a 100% success rate on tested systems. Will Dorman is a highly respected independent security researcher with a long track record of validating and documenting Windows vulnerabilities. Kevin Beaumont is a former Microsoft employee turned independent security expert who operates one of the most followed threat intelligence accounts in the security community. When both of these individuals independently verify that a zero-day works on the latest fully patched Windows 11, that is not a claim that can be dismissed as theoretical. Kevin Beaumont said he tested the exploit successfully on the latest version of Windows 11. I've tried it. It works on latest Windows 11, Beaumont said. Beaumont published 3 detection queries and hunting rules to help defenders identify potential attacks, targeting ShieldBreak. The specific mechanism of ShieldBreak exploits a weakness in Windows Defender, the built-in antivirus and security software that is Microsoft's primary consumer-facing endpoint protection tool. The irony is precise and worth dwelling on. Windows Defender is supposed to protect your machine from exactly the kind of exploit ShieldBreak represents. But ShieldBreak exploits a flaw in Defender itself, using the protection mechanism as the attack vector. Security researcher Will Dorman confirmed that Windows Defender must be enabled for ShieldBreak to function. The attack requires Defender to be running. The machine with active, updated antivirus protection is the machine that can be exploited through this specific technique. Disabling your antivirus is not a fix. It would expose you to other attacks. But the structural situation is deeply uncomfortable. The security software you rely on has a component that, under specific conditions, can be turned against you. The disclosure came one day after Microsoft's monthly Patch Tuesday and marks the 10th zero-day from the researcher since April, amid an ongoing dispute over the company's vulnerability handling practices. Microsoft has not released an official patch, though Tom's hardware testing suggests the latest updates may have inadvertently addressed the issue, and Defender now detects the exploit code. May have inadvertently addressed is not a patch. It is a circumstantial observation that something in recent updates appears to have reduced the exploitability of this specific technique, which means either the vulnerability has been silently fixed, partially fixed, or the specific proof of concept code has been added to Defender's detection signatures without the underlying vulnerability being fully remediated. None of those scenarios constitute the confirmed, deliberate, complete fix that would allow users to be confident the issue is resolved. Now, let's talk about the broader Nightmare Eclipse campaign, because ShieldBreak did not emerge in isolation. It is the 10th entry in a sequence of deliberate, escalating disclosures that began in April 2026. The latest exploits follow the researcher's previous disclosure of the Blue Hammer, CVE 2026-33825, and Red Sun, no identifier, local privilege escalation flaws, both of which began to be exploited in the wild shortly after being publicly disclosed. Blue Hammer and Red Sun were not just proofs of concept that stayed in research papers. They were adopted by actual attackers who weaponized them in real attacks shortly after the public disclosure. This is the consequence of publishing working exploit code without coordinated vendor disclosure. The knowledge becomes available simultaneously to defenders who want to protect against it and to attackers who want to use it. The researcher stated that the decision to publicly disclose the yellow key and green plasma vulnerabilities, along with guidance on how to leverage them, was driven by dissatisfaction with Microsoft's handling of bug reports. Chaotic Eclipse, or Nightmare Eclipse on GitHub, said that they will keep leaking exploits for undocumented Windows vulnerabilities, even promising a big surprise for the next Patch Tuesday. The big surprise promise is not empty. Every previous month since April, a new disclosure has arrived. The cadence is deliberate. The researcher controls when the next vulnerability drops. And Microsoft's ability to patch vulnerabilities faster than they are being disclosed is being tested in a way that has no clear historical precedent. The Green Plasma vulnerability, released alongside Yellow Key, is specifically relevant because of how it chains with the BitLocker bypass we covered in our previous episode. Green Plasma and Mini Plasma remain unpatched and represent viable privilege escalation paths for any attacker who achieves initial code execution through Yellow Key or any other vector. Site, an attack chain where Yellow Key provides initial unauthorized access to an encrypted drive, and Green Plasma or Mini Plasma provides privilege. Escalation to system level represents a complete and end-to-end compromised path from a USB drive and physical access to full system control, combining multiple Nightmare Eclipse disclosures into a single coherent attack sequence. Now, let's step away from the Nightmare Eclipse campaign and discuss something fundamentally different in its attack model, the Download More RAM research from the University of Birmingham, because this vulnerability operates through a completely different attack surface that does not require physical access to the machine at all. Researchers from the University of Birmingham and Durham University reveal a major flaw in the trust assumptions underpinning modern Windows security. Their award-winning research shows that some consumer memory modules let an attacker bypass security protections. Windows relies on with no physical access to the machine. The attack, named Download More RAM, exploits the fact that many dual inline memory modules have no write protection on the configuration chip, telling the computer how much memory is installed. To understand why this matters, you need to understand what SPD chips are. Every DIMM, every memory module, has a small configuration chip called the Serial Presence Detect chip, which contains information about the memory module's characteristics, its capacity, its speed, its timing parameters, and the amount of memory it provides. When your computer boots, it reads the SPD chip on each memory module to determine how much RAM is installed and how to configure the memory controller to work with it. This information is fundamental to how Windows manages memory. The operating system allocates memory, runs processes, and enforces security boundaries based on the assumption that the SPD chip's information accurately describes the physical memory present. Our work exploits the fact that all processes share the same memory to bypass Windows's strongest security guarantees. Previous attacks of this kind needed a screwdriver and physical access to the machine. This one just needs a script. By writing false information to the SPD chip, claiming the module has more memory than it actually does, which is the origin of the Download More RAM name, a reference to the old internet joke about downloading RAM, an attacker can cause Windows to allocate memory addresses that do not correspond to actual physical memory. When Windows tries to use those addresses, the memory controller's behavior in this undefined state creates conditions that can be exploited to bypass Windows memory isolation mechanisms, the same mechanisms that enforce security boundaries between processes, prevent one application from reading another's memory, and underpin many of Windows' most fundamental security guarantees. Microsoft acknowledged the team's findings, assigned CVE 2026-23670, and issued mitigations in its April 2026 security updates. Windows machines running with Secure Boot enabled are protected against the attack in its current form. Machines without Secure Boot remain vulnerable, and the research team advises users to ensure that Secure Boot is enabled. Corsair has added a feature to its IQ tooling that lets owners retroactively enable write protection on their memory modules, closing the hole at the hardware level. The free tool H2Info has also adopted this functionality, providing mitigation for non-Corsair models. Some motherboards offer a BIOS setting to block writes to memory configuration chips, which users can enable as an interim measure. The hardware-level mitigation, write protecting the SPD chip so its contents cannot be modified, is the most complete protection against this attack. But the software-level mitigation requires Secure Boot to be enabled. We have mentioned Secure Boot multiple times across this series. This is another data point in the accumulating case that Secure Boot is not optional security theater, but a genuinely critical protection layer that users should verify is active on their machines. A machine without Secure Boot is now potentially vulnerable to a memory-level security bypass that requires no physical access, just a script that can be delivered through any of the normal malware delivery vectors. Now, let's talk about the third major research disclosure, Pass the Passkey, presented at Black Hat USA 2026 on August 5th, because it targets a completely different authentication layer and one that is specifically supposed to be the most phishing-resistant, most secure authentication method available to Windows users. SpectreOps says Windows stored past YubiKey signatures in clear text where authenticated unprivileged users, including remote users, could read them. The firm says chaining those signatures with weaknesses in Microsoft Entra ID's passkey validation allowed privileged user impersonation despite policies requiring phishing-resistant MFA. The Windows issue is tracked as CVE 2026-34348, an information disclosure vulnerability in the Windows Event Logging Service. Passkeys, hardware security keys like YubiKey or platform authenticators using device, TPM, and biometrics, are the authentication technology that the security industry has been promoting as the solution to password-based security weaknesses. Unlike passwords, they cannot be phished. Unlike SMS codes, they cannot be intercepted through SIM swapping. Unlike software authenticators, they cannot be compromised by malware that reads the authenticator database. Passkeys are supposed to be the final answer to the authentication security problem, specifically because the private key never leaves the hardware device. You cannot steal what cannot be transmitted. Pass the passkey demonstrates a flaw in this model as implemented in Windows and Microsoft Entra ID. Windows stored past YubiKey signatures in clear text in the Windows Event Logging Service, where authenticated unprivileged users, including remote users, could read them. The private key never left the YubiKey. The hardware security property was maintained, but a previous authentication signature generated by the YubiKey was logged in clear text in the Windows Event Log. And that signature, extracted from the log by an attacker with any level of authenticated access to the machine, including remote authenticated access, could be replayed against weaknesses in Entra ID's passkey validation to impersonate the legitimate user. This is the pass-the-hash attack of the passkey era. Pass-the-hash, a well-known attack technique, involves stealing the hash representation of a password from Windows memory and using it to authenticate as the user without knowing the actual password. The underlying principle is the same. Instead of stealing credentials, you use an artifact of a previous authentication to replay the authentication. The specific implementation here exploits clear text logging of authentication signatures combined with Entra ID validation weaknesses, but the conceptual model is identical. And it means that machines logging into Microsoft services with hardware security keys that were supposed to provide phishing-resistant authentication may have been vulnerable to credential replay attacks that completely undermined the security guarantee those keys were supposed to provide. Microsoft told the Hacker News that it has applied mitigations for the reported issue involving passkey relay assertions and continues investing in security enhancements across authentication methods. The fix for the Entra ID side of this issue has been applied server-side by Microsoft. The fix for CVE 2026-34348, the clear text logging vulnerability in the Windows Event Logging Service, is available through a Microsoft security update, but the existence of this vulnerability requires any organization that has relied on YubiKey or passkey authentication as a phishing-resistant MFA control to evaluate whether that authentication was actually as resistant as assumed during the window when the vulnerability existed. Let's now talk about an additional BitLocker vulnerability that emerged alongside the July 2026 Patch Tuesday and extends the physical access encryption bypass landscape beyond Yellow Key specifically. CVE 2026-50661 exposes encrypted devices to physical attacks that can completely undermine Microsoft's disk encryption guarantees. The flaw stems from a protection mechanism failure in BitLocker's device encryption workflow, allowing an unauthorized attacker with hands-on access to a system to circumvent BitLocker and access data stored on the system drive. Microsoft lists CVE 2026-50661 as publicly disclosed but not yet observed in active exploitation at the time of the July 2026 Patch Tuesday release. CVE 2026-50661 is a separate vulnerability from Yellow Key. Different mechanism, different affected scope, same general outcome. It demonstrates that the BitLocker bypass landscape is not a single fixed point, but an expanding area of research where multiple independent techniques through different attack paths are converging on the same result. Multiple researchers, multiple research firms, multiple CVE numbers, all finding different ways to access BitLocker protected data through physical access attacks that do not require the encryption key. The cumulative picture is not one vulnerability that needs one fix, but a category of attack that requires systemic hardening of the entire boot and encryption management chain. Now, let's go through the specific actions required across all of these discovered vulnerabilities. Because the right response to 5 distinct vulnerability categories is not 5 separate settings checks, but a coherent, prioritized hardening plan that addresses the most critical exposures first. The first and most urgent action is verifying that all Windows updates through July 2026 are installed, including the June 9th Patch Tuesday updates that fixed Yellow Key and related BitLocker bypasses, and the July 14th updates that addressed CVE 2026-50661 and the broader July vulnerability package. Open settings, then Windows Update, then update history, and confirm that cumulative updates from June 9th and July 14th appear as successfully installed. For machines that were blocked from the July update due to the Dell compatibility issue covered in our dedicated episode, verify that KB51221-767 is installed. The June and July updates together close the majority of the documented physical access encryption bypass vulnerabilities. The second action is enabling secure boot if it is not already active. This is the primary mitigation for CVE 2026-23670, the download more RAM memory bypass attack from the University of Birmingham research. Open system information by typing MSINFO32 in the start menu and check the secure boot state value. It should show on. If it shows off or unsupported, navigate to your UEFI firmware settings during startup and enable secure boot. For machines where enabling secure boot causes boot issues due to unsigned drivers or bootloaders, which can happen on systems with certain configurations, the appropriate path is to address those specific conflicts rather than leaving secure boot disabled, because the protection it provides is now documented to be essential for multiple attack categories simultaneously. The third action is implementing the SPD chip write protection for the download more RAM vulnerability at the hardware level, if your hardware supports it. If you have Corsair memory modules, the IQ software provides a setting to enable write protection on the SPD chips. For non-Corsair modules, H.Winfo, a free hardware monitoring tool, has added equivalent functionality for compatible modules. Additionally, check your motherboard's BIOS or UEFI settings for an option to lock or write protect SPD chips. This option appears in the memory configuration section on some motherboard firmware and provides the hardware level closure for this attack vector independent of software settings. The fourth action is switching BitLocker to TPM plus PIN if you have not already done so from our previous episode. This remains the most important configuration change for physical access attack scenarios across Yellow Key, CVE 2026-50661, and the boot manager downgrade attacks. Open control panel, then system and security, then BitLocker drive encryption, then change how drive is unlocked at startup, and add a startup PIN. Alternatively, run manage BDE protectors. Add C, TPM and PIN in an elevated command prompt. The PIN requirement closes the attack paths that depend on TPM-only automatic key release at boot time. The fifth action addresses shield break specifically, and this one requires intellectual honesty about what you can and cannot do while an official verified patch is not confirmed. Microsoft has not released an official patch, though Tom's hardware testing suggests the latest updates may have inadvertently addressed the issue, and Defender now detects the exploit code. The appropriate response in this situation is to ensure your Windows updates are current, which may include whatever inadvertent fix has reduced Shieldbreak's exploitability, and to ensure Windows Defender is up to date with current definitions, since Defender appears to be detecting the known proof-of-concept exploit code. Monitor Microsoft's Security Response Center for an official CVE assignment and patch for Shieldbreak, and install it promptly when it arrives. Kevin Beaumont's detection queries, published on his security blog, can be used by organizations with EDR tools to identify potential Shieldbreak exploitation attempts. The sixth action addresses pass the passkey specifically. If you or your organization uses hardware security keys, YubiKey, Windows Hello security keys, or platform passkeys through Windows Hello biometrics, through Microsoft Entra ID or Microsoft 365 commercial authentication, verify that the CVE 2026-34348 update has been installed through the standard Windows update process, as it patches the Windows Event Logging Service vulnerability that enables clear text signature extraction. Additionally, rotate credentials and review authentication logs for any accounts that used passkey authentication during the period between when this vulnerability became exploitable and when the fix was applied. Suspicious authentication events in that window, particularly from unfamiliar IP addresses or at unusual times, may warrant further investigation. The seventh action is enabling Windows Credential Guard if you are on Windows 11 Pro or Enterprise and have not done so in response to our earlier episodes. Credential Guard uses virtualization-based security to isolate authentication credentials in a protected environment that is inaccessible to processes running at the normal operating system level, including, importantly, to processes attempting to read clear text credentials or authentication artifacts from Windows components. Navigate to Settings, then Privacy and Security, then Device Security, then Core Isolation Details, and enable memory integrity if it is not already on. Additionally, verify that virtualization-based security is shown as running in the System Information tool. Type MSINFO32 and look for virtualization-based security in the System Summary section. The eighth action is specifically for organizations and for any individual who manages machines used by others. The Nightmare Eclipse campaign is not finished. The researcher has stated explicitly that further disclosures are planned, The researchers stated that they will keep leaking exploits for undocumented Windows vulnerabilities. The appropriate organizational response to an ongoing, deliberate public vulnerability disclosure campaign against Windows is to establish a monitoring and rapid response process specifically for zero-day disclosures, rather than relying solely on the monthly Patch Tuesday cycle. Following Bleeping Computer, The Hacker News, and Kevin Beaumont's security blog as sources that document these disclosures as they occur, typically within hours of a new GitHub publication by Nightmare Eclipse, allows for awareness of new attack techniques before Microsoft has assigned a CVE, which is the window where official guidance is absent, but the exploit code is publicly available. Let's step back and look at the broader pattern that all of these disclosures together reveal, because the individual vulnerabilities each matter, but the pattern they collectively illustrate matters even more. Windows security is under sustained multi-front pressure from a set of research disclosures that are specifically targeting the mechanisms users have been told to rely on. The password? Bypassed by yellow key without needing to know it. BitLocker encryption? Bypassed by yellow key and CVE 2026-50661 through the recovery and protection mechanism environment. Windows Defender? The attack surface for shieldbreak. Hardware passkeys and phishing-resistant MFA. The attack surface for pass the passkey. Memory isolation and Windows security guarantees, the attack surface for download more RAM, the login screen, the entry point for privilege escalation through Shieldbreak, Green Plasma, Mini Plasma, and Blue Hammer. This is not a coincidence. These are researchers and research teams specifically targeting the features that Windows users and Windows security architects have been relying upon as their most trusted protections. Each disclosure is a demonstration that a specific trust assumption, this feature is secure, this mechanism is reliable, this protection does what it says, requires more scrutiny, more caveats, and more supporting controls than the marketing suggested. The correct response is not panic. The correct response is not distrust of Windows as a platform. Every major platform faces equivalent security research scrutiny and equivalent vulnerability disclosures. The correct response is exactly what this series has been building toward from its first episode, Informed. Deliberate configuration of your machine's security settings based on understanding what each protection actually does and what its documented limitations are, rather than accepting defaults on the assumption that the defaults are appropriate for your threat model. Secure boot enabled, BitLocker with TPM plus PIN, credential guard active, Windows updates current, including June and July 2026. SPD chip write protection applied where hardware supports it, Defender definitions current. Authentication logs reviewed for pass the passkey exposure window. Monitoring in place for the next Nightmare Eclipse disclosure. That is not a long list. Each item on it is implementable today on most Windows 11 machines without specialized knowledge or enterprise tools. And together, they represent the difference between a machine configured by defaults that were set years ago without anticipating the 2026 vulnerability landscape, and a machine configured by an informed user who understands what is being attacked and what protections actually work. The researcher known as Nightmare Eclipse has promised more disclosures. Microsoft is working to close the vulnerabilities as fast as they are published. You are in the middle of that race. Make sure your machine is on the right side of it.